Hey there, everybody. Another time for Terry Francis and I to get together and sit down and have a couple discussions about the work of an evangelist. Terry will be joining us shortly as we begin our broadcast this afternoon. We're going to be talking about one of the complications and difficulties to the spiritual aspects of your life in conjunction with your work and how we do so successfully. Terry, good to see you.
Good to see you.
I hope you're doing all right. Hope everything's all settled in for you. You've got your mobile office there working for you, it looks like.
Yes, can you hear me, by the way? I'm making sure the headphones are working.
Yes, and the classic canard from many a trope of commercials. Yes, I can hear you now.
Good. Awesome. I just wanted to be outside to show you how it's done without connectivity issues.
Right, yeah, you're outside. Yes, that's how it is. Go tromp around the woods for an hour trying to fix someone's technical issues. And
My
come
deck
back and
will
talk
work
to me.
just fine. My deck will work just fine.
All right, so again, our topic really focuses down to how can we bring a healthy spiritual balance in our life, in our work, in our family, and then as an evangelist, also ourselves. The classic challenging question, physician, heal thyself, which is an issue as well.
Yeah, and let's give a little hat tip to Timothy Ruffin for the question that kind of spurred this. Last week he asked how, I can't remember the specific words, but he asked us how we balance our private personal study versus our study for our work as far as
Right.
that goes. I guess the best way to put that.
And I'll be fair from my side, and Terry can be fair from his. I haven't always done that well. Uh, and even now, 20 plus years into my work, I don't always do it well now. But there
I don't.
are, tremendous pressures on any individual's life. And so what we're going to try to do is talk about some best case aspects, perhaps, but also identify failure points that we've recognized. Because it might be as simple as this. If spiritual insight from the scriptures is the food that our soul needs, and we focus exclusively on feeding other people, we sometimes fail to feed ourselves. And we've got to do a better job that way. And I think that's some of the areas where preachers sometimes struggle. Much like a mechanic has a bunch of broken cars in his yard because he's tired of working on cars all day at work, and he comes home and he's like, I don't want to fix another one of those. Sometimes that's how preachers feel. It may not actually look like that, but I know that it feels that way sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a challenge. I know that's the struggle for me is I go to the office and first off, let me confess, I'm not a great reader. I mean, I read fine. That came off the wrong way. I don't. My wife will.
Roll that back and
Yeah,
replay that a
yeah,
second time.
yeah. My wife will. She's read the Harry Potter series probably 8 times, which is a joke for us because she still cries every time Dumbledore dies, and I always give her a hard time. It's like it's happened the other 7 times. But she loves to read. My kids, for the most part, love to read. I don't love to read. I was the kid that wanted to play outside all the time. So I ended up doing something for the rest of my life that forces me to read a lot. And so what happens is if I come home and it's like I need to read a book for personal devotion, yeah, I'm not feeling that today.
Right.
And that's kind of the challenge that there is. And I know one of the downfalls in my life has been I don't do this well. I don't do this well personally. I don't do this well as a dad. Let me get that out there too, because we're going to talk about family too. I don't do that well either. I mean, my life is pretty hectic like everybody else's, by the way. I mean, I got 3 kids. I got 1 in college. I've got 2 that are here, 1 in high school, 1 in middle school. I've got 2 elderly parents that live with us. And one of them demands more attention than the other. There's a lot of stress and anxiety, and while I should pray more, study more to be probably the medication for that stress and anxiety, the reality is I find myself a lot of times probably sitting in front of a TV vegging out to some ridiculous documentary or show as a way of kind of escape rather than diving into some kind of devotion. So, and what that does is it creates a problem in me personally sometimes, because the majority of my work, reading and studying, is for a collective discussion, not individual growth, and that's the challenge.
Right. This is one of the reasons why I regularly recommend a particular book. And I know Terry's probably going to struggle to chew on the idea of reading another book, but it's an easy read.
Yeah.
It's by Pat Gelsinger. It's called The Juggling Act. Its title is right on point, bringing balance to your faith and your family. I mean, it's really right down that track. And I have seen decision points in my life where I implement these principles that he talks about successfully. Things get better. When I forget to do those particular success points, things get worse. It's really simple that way. But let's kind of break a couple things down that I think are important ideas in this area as a big picture concept. So on the work side, I found that for me, if I can create structure around my work plan, then I can know that now I am working on a project and now I am not working on a project. And so preachers are often project-based. Projects are Bible classes, projects are individual studies, projects are sermons, projects are theme things, maybe bulletins, maybe videos. And so if I can pocket those down into project space, then I know that I'm done. And there's a sense of I'm not at work anymore. With that, then I can say, okay, now what do I do this time that I have? Can I invest it into my family? Can I invest it into my own spiritual growth? And have I budgeted for that? Because that's a common issue, not just for preachers, by the way. If you're working as an engineer and you're working 60 hours a week, if you're working as a police officer and you're on doubles, and maybe you're working nights and filling in for somebody, you got to figure out how to incorporate spiritual time too. And so this fitting it in there is important. And so maybe it's that little extra time in the morning where you say, this is for me. And I'll expand it. It's not just about reading a book. Sometimes spiritual growth takes place in prayer. Sometimes spiritual growth takes place in contemplation. And for me personally, I don't get to do it like I would love to do. If I had control over it, I'd be on a river paddling a canoe every single day. But for me personally, that is some of the most rewarding introspective times with that smooth glide of the canoe across the water. That works for me. And so I know that. And so afterwards, there's a great lift in my perspective after those kind of events. So that's part of the package.
Yeah. For me, it's a pontoon boat with a fishing pole, but we all have our contemplative meditation time, be another way to describe that. Another book I read, and I don't even know if it's in print anymore. Gordon MacDonald wrote a book that I read years ago called Ordering Your Private World. And one of the things he pointed out in there is the need to set aside a time period that is just for your prayer and meditation and study personally. And to do that, and he tied that into when you're at, quote, work or your office as a minister. And because one of the explanations is your personal growth will limit the collective growth if you're not careful. Yeah. And to close the door, to turn off the phone for that period of time during the day, you're essentially unavailable, and to not feel guilty about that. And I don't know that I've always done that well, but I think there's some wisdom in that area of advice as you budget time to set aside a period of time that this is just going to be for prayer today, and this is also going to be for studying. The other thing I'll say about that is I'm a very easily distracted person, mm-hmm. and what adds to that distraction is an attention span that's not fantastic. I heavily recommend that if you are project-based, that as you budget your time, one of the things you might do is say, okay, I'm going to spend half an hour to an hour on this, and then I'm going to change over here for a little bit and then come back to that to redirect your thoughts, and to often that change of mindset between two different emphases will actually make you be more focused and balanced in what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and another thing that happens based more about where you live, and this is on the work side of things, if there are preacher studies of preachers getting together to study together, those can be very rewarding on the individual level. They need to be run right, and they need to have some good leadership involved and some good expectations. You can't just come together and swap some sermons, have a lunch, and go home and expect to improve. But that can be a way that you can structure personal growth. You can structure it. Another thing that I'm aware of, I know a couple gospel preachers who intentionally meet with mentors on a regular basis. They set up time to get together with someone whom they respect and trust, and they say, "Hey, let's share and let's talk. You help me grow in this area where I haven't grown before." Locally, that could be an elder, that could be an older member. Uh, it could be someone who's retired from preaching, or maybe did some great work that connects to your work over the years. And those can be very rewarding on the individual level. And the earlier you get into that practice, the better it will be for you in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that.
And it's real simple. I mean, it's a structure. A lot of times in our lives, we need those little structurally sound points to make things get functional. Let's shift into the next category we've got laid out, just because they kind of intertwine a little bit. And that's spiritual balance in your family life, especially the stress on the preacher's edge. We hinted at this earlier. You spend anywhere from 20 to 50 hours getting classes and sermons ready each week. And then you have the rigor of life, practices, schedules, homework, work related aspects for maybe your kids are working, maybe your spouse works. And so by the time you get past dinner successfully, you may be thoroughly exhausted. So it's really hard to emotionally ramp up and invest yourself into a structured study at that point physically, because it's a hard thing for folks to process that preacher work wears you out in the flesh just as much as it does in the mind. You're tired, just like everybody else is at the end of the day. One of the things that we could all do better at is building a better inclusive model in some way, so that our work doesn't then bleed over into the preacher stuff or into the family side of things. And that would be an area where I think, really effectively, as preachers, as dads, as parents to our children, as caregivers for our family, we need to be better at it. We need to include those spiritual things, because the struggles that our kids are going through, they're different than the struggles we went through. They just simply are vastly shifted from the experiences of our youth. They're just not the same. And they bring a whole lot of new complications. The internet did not exist when I was a kid. When I was early into college, you could dial up from one computer to another computer. And that was like the introduction to connectivity in that regard. That brought with a whole host of new challenges, new relationship issues. And so there's learning that has to take place on a parent side and a family side to navigate all those new things. And we've got to have a good, healthy a spiritual connection through those things, because there's going to be difficulty and challenges that they'll need that strength that might come through us in that regard too.
Yeah, as a dad, one of the things I think I do a good job at is I do a good job dealing with more of those social issues they face, and partly because, especially with my middle child, I drive her to school and I pick her up most days from practice, and that's about a 15-minute one-way drive. And when we do that, there's a lot of conversation about what's going on and how we deal with different spiritual challenges in her life. And that's something that I'm thankful for, that I have that time. Where I think the challenge becomes sometimes is to remember that there is a need for family devotion time. That it can't just all be spontaneous instruction, but there's a need for prayer together, and there's a need for family time. We've done a few things to try to influence that more. We put up a prayer board in our kitchen. We pray longer before our meals than we used to, because at least we're all together. Sometimes, some days, that's the only time we're all together,
Yeah.
just because of our schedules.
Well, in your case, one of your kids is off at college, and so that's a shift in
Yeah,
relationship there that's going to make some of that prioritizing different. Yeah, and to the tenor of Timothy's question, had he brought this thing specifically on the personal level, your earlier comment that the growth of the preacher is basically a barrier or an open door to growth for those that are listening.
yeah,
Um, Here's some things that might be tools to help. And I know that they helped me in the past in some areas. Point number one, study to preach on things that you need to hear.
hmm
And I think most preachers do that, but do so with intentional planning. You're a dad, you're a child, you've got parent relationships. You need things that are connected that way. You need foundational truths just as much as you need big picture ideas. So study with your heart in mind as well. Secondly, a thing that would connect it on the individual level, like Terry's pointed out, you got to carve out time for you.
hmm
And that means it needs to actually be considered in part of your work. I have some friends who are true introverts, and they don't go away from people because they don't like people. They go away from people to recharge, to go re-engage people the next time.
Because they're exhausted, and if they don't, it's a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah, and Terry exhausts us, but that's for a different reason. And that's one of those barbs. It'll come back again. He's about to dump the cold water on my head. It's normal.
No, I'm going to
Uh,
rise above you.
Good luck with that. You're gonna have to use a
Yeah.
stepping stool. Um, but find a time to enjoy things that God has granted us together. Go laugh together. That's part of the spiritual connection of families. Go spend time in prayer together, but also do so with the intent for you too. And find those things that are going to be able to fit into the boxes of your life as an evangelist. I've got a friend who he preaches not near me. I won't give details so you can figure out who he is. But for
It took an
years he
hour
did.
for you guys to talk the other day. Let's just put it that
Yeah,
way.
that wasn't David Dan. Uh, uh, it took us an hour to figure out how to talk. No,
Yeah.
for years he gets up much earlier than everybody else, earlier than I do, and I'm usually awake at about 6 a.m. But he uses that time for his personal development. He gets up super early in the morning to go have that coffee outside, to go spend some time spiritually building whom he is. And so the reason I bring that up is that to find that niche that works for you and then guard it and protect it. Terry and I can both tell you that we don't always do a good job of guarding and protecting that time that we need to be ourselves spiritually, because our work is so outwardly focused. People just assume, well, that's what recharges you. No, that's not exactly it. We do certainly benefit from that way because of our personalities, but there's more to it than that. There's some great key factors of having that key balance. And it's not just preachers again. Our focus in this work right now is preachers, but there's a bigger connectivity point for everybody as well.
Well, and if people haven't figured out yet, I'm a tremendous extrovert. So I'm the opposite. Sometimes I have to get out of my office away from being by myself in order to recharge. And one of the things that I do sometimes to do that is it's quite common for me to go to a coffee shop with my computer, with a book, maybe a computer, my Bible, whatever, and to go and at least be out in public where I can still study, but I'm not so isolated. And sometimes I do some of my greatest actual personal study that way by changing my environment. And so when you think about, especially as we move into your individual growth, don't be afraid to be selfish with your time, but also sometimes change your environment to motivate you to do better in this area. And it's amazing sometimes when a change of scenery. You talked about a canoe, and that's your favorite quiet place. I'll tell you, fishing on the lake's my quiet place, and there's a lot of times that happens with my family. and it's a great time for our family to go away. Our phones don't work on the water usually. We're not checking our email. There are no TVs. We may go out there. We have a grill on our boat too, so we may go out there for an entire day,
Yeah.
and we may go out there and just be away from everybody. And that recharges us. And during that time, by the way, there's some spiritual discussions that happen. I mean, how could you float around for 6 hours on a lake and the beauty of God's creation and not talk about that?
Right.
So again, I think environment sometimes adds to this, as odd as that may sound.
Right. And one of the things we're pointing at is that you have a workspace and a personal space. That seems to work for a lot of folks. We're trying to be general because each preacher is not the same. Each person is not the same. Terry and I both like outdoors. Some people, they go outside and they melt. The sun's too bright for them. And so they've got to find a different way to achieve those same goals. Other folks actually recharge with energy around them, and they want to go to large crowds and be around lots of folks. Figure those things out, and then again, guard them. They're necessary parts of your work. They're necessary parts of your family. They're necessary parts of the big picture that is you. A couple more things. I see all these comments from time to time about how you value your work, if you will. And things like, well, no one's going to praise you at the end of your life because you clocked in an extra 2 hours at work that day, and stuff like that. It's not exactly like that. And here's my point with that. The reason I point that out is sometimes an extra 2 hours of work for the preacher means somebody's soul. It means a heart that you brought closer to God. And so with that component there and that piece there, that's a struggle on the spiritual side for a preacher, because 2 hours more of our work is a little bit different in some ways than 2 hours at the office, with a calculator in front of your hand and you're doing taxes. I can say taxes now because it's the 16th, and hopefully everyone's either filed or filed extensions. So it's a little different there for how it feels. And service industry type jobs feel that way too. Folks that are, caring for people. 2 hours means maybe someone learned to walk again, or someone got the care that they needed. And so that creates some of these balance issues too, because I'm a driven person. I want to try to do the best that I can do with each task that's in front of me. And so with that comes an intensity to doing it really well and pouring all of myself into it. And sometimes I lose track of the clock. That's one of the things, again, why I recommended that book by Gelsinger, because he's kind of that way. And I think a lot of preachers are kind of that way, where he's had to make some serious adjustments to being at home and being spiritually minded at home. Preachers need to do that too, and probably more than others in some ways, because we're so tired about that same area.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's where probably from my standpoint, my greatest failure is just not making that as high a priority as it should be. And I think that's where a lot of us are, where we just, especially as a dad, have to sit down and go, okay, we are going to do this together. Because it's what we need for the greater good of all of us.
Yeah, and our spouses are really helpful that way too. They sometimes serve as our internal reminders. It says, hey, we plan to do this. Hey, we need to do this. We listen, we learn from those things. I cited in our broadcast today a passage that sometimes has a different application. Keep close walking yourself in the teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing, you will save both yourself and your hearers. And we talk about that only in the vein of make sure you haven't sinned. That's the keeping yourself watched in that regard. I think the meaning to that contextually is much larger. Is that you're really approaching life to a higher degree of focus on making God part of it. And that can come across in conversations about holiness. It can come across in conversations about God's creation, or just dealing with the consequences of life, like your car rides home, which I do often too for some of our kids. The oldest tends to drive himself everywhere now, so my job as a chauffeur seems to be minimal there. But those are times where we can really do that. We can invest ourselves and get balance. And the youngest edge of it, of our lives, needs to where we start to build this for the older edges. And if I had done better about this earlier, it would have been easier now.
Yeah. Hal Hammons added that Jonathan Edwards has said to spend 13 to 14 hours, office hours a day. That included other spiritual responsibilities and just study. Still, I can't help thinking that's a recipe for burnout. I just want to say I agree with that. I think, well, first off, and I'm going to say something that's not meant to be condescending. So let me I know whenever somebody says that, then they're like, oh, I see. I don't know what you would do in your office for 14 hours a day, 5 days a week, quite frankly.
Well, Terry, you can't read.
Yeah, I can't read. Go back to that. There's only so much solitaire I can play. No, I'm just kidding. And what I mean by that is there's some things we need to be active doing that we can't do in our office.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So from that standpoint, I think it's important to realize that. And the other thing is, absolutely, if you cram me in an office 14 hours a day, 5 days a week, I'm going to burn out quickly. So quickly, I'm going to go find a different job is what I'm going to do if that's what this looks like. Because I personally, I can't do that, I guess is the best way for me to put that. And if you know that, you've got to figure out a different way to take care of yourself in that sense to prevent burnout. There's been a lot of stuff recently about preachers with depression and also preachers with the need for their sabbaticals and that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying those kind of things may not be needed, but I think if we did a better job of preventing burnout before we get to that point, that overall some of those things would reduce. And maybe that's a whole other broadcast, but just some thoughts.
Well, yeah, and certainly I think in the future we will be discussing preacher burnout and depression in preaching, because there is an emotional component to preaching that is hard to quantify. And a lot of folks really don't grasp that strain of the fact that we are pouring ourselves out in every single sermon. Especially the ones that you look at and go, I didn't understand that. I didn't get that. Well, there's a lot that goes behind it that is maybe not being conveyed well that day by that preacher, because not every preacher has every single sermon that's a home run. And in fact, most of them are bunts, to use baseball analogies, and every once in a while we'll hit a double. And if your heart's ready, then you get to hear a home run, is really probably the other end of it. But right, that 13-hour, 14-hour office day, Alexander Campbell basically went blind through his studies. And now he also had poor lighting. That was a factor, but he had that same, aspect of it. And to different folks, our friend Bobby Blackburn, Daniel brought him up. He's a real big advocate of having a cycle of sabbatical and a cycle of break. And for a lot of folks, that's necessary. And maybe for Terry and I, it's necessary. We just don't know how to do it. And that's on the confessional side of the conversation. Like we said at the beginning, this is definitely an area where Terry and I acknowledge various levels of failure and struggle to do it to the best capacity.
Well, and we're more on the burnout side now, but I will tell you that further confession, the control freak side of me struggles with not doing anything at all for 3 months. And that probably means I need to not do anything at all for 3 months. I realize that. But I understand how that works and how that's needed. And again, that's probably another future broadcast. But to get back to this, I think the overall thing that we just want to say is, look, it is very difficult, I think, and for preachers, it's difficult for everybody to set aside time for personal devotion study, family time, study, devotion. I think that's difficult for everybody. Preachers struggle with that too. I think the greatest challenge to that is, quite frankly, we justify it because we've studied spiritual things all day. And we think it's okay. And I know I've done that in my life where I'm like, well, look, I've read the Bible for 6 hours today. Just come on, I can't do any more. And sometimes you gotta force yourself. to go a little further.
And again, going back to specifically to Timothy's great question, let me add one more tidbit. If you live in an area where there are Christians who are gathering together that you're not having to prepare to teach the study, go to that study. I know where you're at there, working with the congregation at Spring Hill. There are brethren who gather together during the week in different places. Go to one of those studies, not even if part of the congregation where you're at's work, and just be a person. I know it's going to be hard to take off the phylactery of the preacher that people see, even if it's not there. But go participate, learn. If you don't know about them, I can tell you a few that I know of that take place in that area. There's some Christians in that area that get together regularly. Just drop in. I know they'd love to see you there. That's an option. But here's one more. We mentioned elders. We mentioned other Christians. Look to someone who seems to have balance figured out in their life and say, show me. Take me along on your journey. Show me how it works for you. I think that's a powerful way to improve in any of these areas. And that's what I've been trying to do more and more as I get a little bit more, as the gray rises, if you will.
Well, and Dan DeGarmo just said the fact that we're talking about these things is an asset. And I think that's why you and I decided to do this, was because we wanted to pull back the curtain. We wanted to be more transparent for regular church members. I hate to use that term. I found no other way to describe it. But also, in addition, for younger preachers to maybe help them avoid some of the things that we've fallen into. And we're trying to be open and honest about some of our struggles and some of the things that preachers struggle with, and some of the advice that maybe we've learned along the way to help somebody maybe avoid those same pitfalls. By the way, let me disclaimer, that doesn't mean we have it all figured out, because we are we always try to admit our failures on here, sometimes maybe too much. But
right. Well, I mean, and to be fair, and Terry can comment equally about this, our work as an evangelist, at least my perspective recently over the last 3 years, has been rising in enthusiasm over the last year and a half. But the year and a half before that, man, it was breaking me. Because as a preacher, if things aren't going well at the congregation, you go home, you can't talk about it with your family there as much as you would like to. Everybody else just has stress at work. They go back to the congregation for support. The preacher doesn't have that. We don't have that included. We should, and we need to, but we don't always build that safe strength, if you will, when things go poorly. And so this is one of those areas. Because if our life gets out of balance in this way, then everything gets sucked down with it, and the whole family gets sucked down in that same vacuum. And it just simply functionally needs to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Which also means that these broadcasts happen because we're both in the stage of our life where we are excited and upbeat about where we're at. And when that changes, then you'll notice, because we don't broadcast anymore.
Not exactly, but maybe.
No, just kidding.
And I'll say for me, and this is as we kind of close our conversation here, we've gotten, I think, a good, healthy start to this. And I have been benefiting from the conversations we've been having as much as we hope to help others. And when folks come in with great new questions, that reminds me of things that we need to talk about. We started with a list of 12 things to talk about, I think, and we've covered like 2 of those. Yeah. And the list is like 3 times as long as when we started, and it will continue to probably grow at that rate, I hope. So there's a lot of stuff to cover in this area as evangelists improve their work.
One thing I want to add before we end, that I meant to add earlier on the individual side, and this is a new thing for me. We talked about this before. My drive time, I drive a lot because I live outside of town, and I'm not a great reader, but I do typically like to prefer talk radio over music anymore, because I think I'm old and don't like music anymore. But podcasts have been a tremendous blessing in this area. And the really nice thing about those is sometimes you can find some of those that are 15 to 30 minutes that really can inject a lot of things into your life spiritually. And you can combine some what is typically downtime with the ability to actually grow spiritually. So let me add that in there real quick.
Yeah, I listen regularly to Excel Still More and Seth Godin's Akimbo. Those are two different corners of my brain that are simulated that actually intercede or intersect right on spiritual points, because they connect to my work, but they connect to my life as well in so many ways.
Yeah.
That's what we hope to accomplish for today. This is probably one of the videos where we both recognize there's a lot of growth that we need to do in this area. And someone make a request. If you see the video, share it, like it, comment. And if you know something that's worked for you, let us know. We can certainly revisit this topic because we're going to need to. There's some areas of it that are going to need some additional insight. But we want to be successful too. And so if you know something's working and it's worked for you, it may work for us individually, not just all people who might eventually watch these things, but Terry and I.
Right.
Because we need that. And, one of the reasons why the preachers always remember their sermons is because people pray for their memory or ready recollection of their sermons. Well, pray for balance in our lives. Pray for our families. Pray for our hearts. Pray that we individually grow in the way that God needs us to.
And also, again, this whole broadcast today was because of a question that got sent in. So we want to reiterate that as we close, that if you have something you'd like for us to talk about, then just send us a private message on Do the Work and let us know that, and we'll add it into the rotation and try to get to it as soon as possible. Yeah,
and if you do not want us to identify you by name, make sure you include that, because we were happy to keep that level of trust and on the close side. So just let us know ahead of time, no matter what the question is.
Absolutely.
We're totally comfortable with that. Everybody, have a great day. Remember, Do the Work on Tuesdays at approximately 11 o'clock Eastern.
Yeah. And make sure you catch our 5 questions. That's going to rotate based on preacher availability. But there was one yesterday that Phil and David Dan did. It was really great. Hope you guys can go watch that.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.